On behalf of the Southern Utah University and the Sherritt Library, I'm happy to welcome you here this evening for our second annual Howard R. Driggs Memorial Lecture. You will hear more in a few minutes about our Dr. Driggs, who was the first English professor at Southern Utah University when it was known as the Branch Normal School. If you were with us a year ago, we were in the auditorium, and I thought something was missing from that program, and I realized what it was is we didn't have the founders with us. So we've moved here to the Great Hall, and over here to my right, to your left, the second, next to Gene Wolfe, that will help some of you, is Howard R. Driggs looking upon us tonight. So we are honored to have him in our presence as well. He was honored several years ago, and his portrait placed here in the Great Hall. My name is Janet Segmiller. I am the Special Collections Librarian, but I'm here in my role tonight as chairman of the committee, the board for the Howard R. Driggs Memorial Lecture. And it is an honor to see all of you here. The students, I'm delighted that you're here, and faculty, and our many friends from the community. We have spent a day since last evening with our honored guest, Dr. Howe, and his lovely wife, Sandra, and we know that you will be as thrilled as we have been with the great people that they are, and we hope that we've impressed upon them what a wonderful campus this is and that they will come back. At this time, it is my privilege to introduce to you one of our committee members on the lecture committee, and actually the person who suggested that we invite Dr. Howe to be our speaker. This is Dr. Alan C. Christensen. Dr. Christensen is part of us because he's part of the Driggs family, a great nephew of Howard R. Driggs, one who knew him and loved him in his life. But Dr. Christensen is also the director of the Ezra Taft Benson Agriculture and Food Institute, which is a joint project now between the LDS Charities and the Brigham Young University. Dr. Christensen has a love of history, and he is the author of a book, Before Zion, an account of the 7th handcart company. This is one that came with a little less struggle than the 6th handcart companies in 1856. And during his career, he's taught at Cal Poly Pomona, and he was appointed by President George W. Bush to the Board for International Food and Agricultural Development. And so I turn the microphone over to Dr. Christensen.
Thank you. I first met Dr. Michael T. Benson at a conference in New York City in 2003. The World Family Policy Center at Brigham Young University was holding a conference there in an attempt to acquaint United Nations diplomats with the work of the World Family Policy Center and the issues facing families across the earth. I was making a presentation on behalf of the Ezra Taft Benson Agriculture and Food Institute. Dr. Michael Benson came to one of those sessions. He'd just been appointed president of Snow College. We were absolutely delighted to see him. I met him next when he spoke at the dedication of the Howard R. Driggs Room in the Sherritt Library. I learned for the first time on that occasion of the close friendship between Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson and Howard R. Driggs. Secretary Benson, on that occasion, had arranged for a meeting of Uncle Howard, Aunt Margaret, and Camille with President Dwight Eisenhower at the White House. and Uncle Howard, on that occasion, gifted to the President of the United States a number of his books. As much as anyone, I suppose, Howard R. Driggs helped create in me a love of history, especially family, American, and LDS church history. He nourished that interest in me when I was a boy, and that effort continued to his death in 1963. 8 years ago, I was invited to assume the leadership of the Ezra Taft Benson Agriculture and Food Institute. It has been an opportunity and an obligation that I've not taken lightly. Secretary Benson was a visionary in the matters of public policy and the needs to address the challenges facing 750 million people who live in poverty on small farms in developing nations. He was clearly ahead of his time. People are just now coming to grips with the fact that if poverty is to be successfully addressed in the less developed nations, then these small farmers must be trained and aided to get their feet on the first rung of the developmental ladder. I sense that Ezra Taft Benson would be very pleased that his grandson, President Michael T. Benson, has devoted his energies to the field of human capital development. I appreciate his leadership of this university, which is intertwined with the history of my extended family. Not only was Howard R. Driggs a founding faculty member, his son H. Wayne Driggs served as director when it was the Branch Agricultural College. Also, another great uncle was on the faculty here. He was the coach of the basketball team that won the championship in 1960. The picture of him and that team hangs in the historic main building. His name was John S. Christensen. With those connections to the history of this university and to the family of Ezra Taft Benson, it is a very great honor to introduce to you the president of Southern Utah University, Dr. Michael T. Benson.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Christensen, and a very warm greeting to all of you. Thank you very much for being here. A special greeting to our guests, Dr. Daniel Walker Howe and his lovely wife of 48 years, Sandra. As I reflected on the Howes arriving in Cedar City last night, I realized that I've known them for almost 20 years now, and my life has been richly blessed by that association. Their son Stephen and I were classmates together at Oxford, and I have many fond memories of our time there in the idyllic setting that is Oxford, England. In thinking about this introduction, and I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize Camille Bradford, the stepdaughter to Howard R. Driggs, who I met in the first few months of my tenure here. And I'd heard about Howard R. Driggs, but she introduced me to a side of him that I had not known about. She presented me with a beautiful set of books, and this association and the family and their commitment to forever enshrining here at the university the legacy of Howard R. Driggs has led to this lecture series. And if you'll remember, last year our first lecture, the inaugural lecture, was given by Governor Michael O'Leavitt, and we were delighted with the success of that, and we expect no less tonight, Professor Howe. So we're delighted to have you here. In thinking about how I might introduce Professor Howe and put a little more interesting spin on it, you can read through his bona fides and his accomplishments in the program. I would highlight just a few. A magna cum laude graduate of Harvard, a master's degree from Oxford, but I would argue his most significant accomplishment at Oxford was meeting his wife, Sandra, who was studying at St. Anne's College at the same time. A doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley. He has taught at Yale, where I found out he was the thesis supervisor to Jeffrey R. Holland, who at the time was doing a PhD in American Studies in New Haven, Connecticut. He was also the department chair at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of History. I first met him in 1992 when he was the Harmsworth Professor of American History which was a visiting chairmanship for a year, but he did such an outstanding job. They asked him to stay for an additional decade, which he did, this time as the Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford University, and I would argue one of the most distinguished chairs probably in all the world for the study of American history. While he was at Oxford, he helped establish the Rothermere Institute, American Institute, which more than just a library, it is an institute dedicated to the study of American history. Interestingly enough, he holds emeritus status from both University of California, Los Angeles and Oxford. And he continues to research and write at UCLA and at the Huntington Library. I have to say this about Professor Howe. He is one of the most kind and unassuming, accomplished academics I've ever met. He is a man completely devoid of the attitude of being full of oneself. And with that list of accomplishments, you might expect the polar opposite from an individual that has done so much. I will end with this last personal note. Professor Howe was born in Ogden, so I don't know, Dan, if this is a product of your 6 months in Ogden, Utah, because he moved shortly thereafter to Colorado, Washington, D.C., and then to Denver. But we receive a Christmas letter every year from the Howe family. And in typical kind of Utah tradition, oftentimes one gets those Christmas letters and they say, you know, Jimmy went to primary this year, we're very excited. Anna learned how to spell. Dad is busy doing this, Mom is doing that. Well, the Howe Christmas family letter of 2008, we saved. And it says this. It goes through some of the things that the family has been up to. They have 3 grown children, what their grandchildren are doing. And then the last line of the Christmas letter says this. For Daniel, for me, it was an eventful year. Dan won the Pulitzer Prize for History. May God's blessings be with you and your family. That really says it all about Dan Howe. It was almost a postscript that here is one of the most notable prizes in American history, in American society. He won it in 2008. Interestingly enough, the 2 books that he defeated, 2 authors, Robert Dallek, a member of my dissertation committee there at Oxford, Nixon and Kissinger, Partners in Power, and posthumously the late David Halberstam, The Coldest Winter, America and the Korean War. Now that's pretty stiff competition, and our speaker tonight beat them both. I'm honored to turn the microphone to a very good friend and an incredible historian, Daniel Walker Howe.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was very nice. I want to thank Dr. John I, who has spent so much time and trouble to make the visit of my wife and me here both happy and successful in every way. So thank you very much, John. And of course, I want to thank my good friend, President Michael Benson, whom I've known for so many years, as you pointed out, for the invitation to Cedar City and Southern Utah University. Although Sandra and I have now lived in California for quite some time, Utah has a very, very treasured place in my heart. And it's always great to be able to come back here. I think perhaps most of all, however, I want to thank the late Howard R. Driggs. Professor Driggs combined a deep interest in Western history with a professional commitment to education and especially the study of English language and literature. My lecture this evening will deal with both these concerns of his, with the westward movement and with the transmission of literacy and language fluency. And to bring these two topics together, I'll be talking about improvements in communications in the 19th century. Now, my presentation is based on my book, What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848. I undertook the book in response to an invitation to write a volume in the series that's called The Oxford History of the United States. When it's complete, that series will cover everything from pre-Columbian times to yesterday. So the years that I write about, 1815 to 1848, are one little segment of a much, much broader project. When I wrote my volume, and there are copies of it in the back if you want to see them afterwards, when I wrote the volume, I knew that I wanted to address not only my fellow historians and our students in the courses that we teach, but the general literate, curious public. In other words, all of you. So on the 24th of May, 1844, Professor Samuel F.B. Morse, seated in the chambers of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, tapped out a message on a funny-looking device of cogs and coiled wires. He used a code that he had recently devised, and he spelled out, "What hath God wrought?" 40 miles away in Baltimore, Morse's associate Alfred Vail received the electric signals and telegraphed the message back. As those who witnessed this demonstration understood, this event would change the world. For thousands of years, messages had been limited by the speed messengers could travel, or the distance eyes could see signals like flags or smoke. Neither Alexander the Great nor Benjamin Franklin, 2,000 years later, had known anything faster than a galloping horse. But from now on, instant long-distance communication would become a practical reality. The years between 1815 and 1848 witnessed dramatic changes in the United States. The America of 1815 was what we might call a third world country. Most people lived on isolated farmsteads. Their lives revolved around the weather and the hours of daylight. Many people grew their own food. Many wives made their own families' clothes. It was the difficulty of transportation and communication that kept their lives so primitive. Only people who lived near navigable waterways could easily market their crops and get money to buy commodities that were not produced locally, for which they could barter with their neighbors or the local storekeeper. With transportation costs high, only luxury goods could bear the cost of long-distance transportation over land. Information from the outside world was among the most precious of luxuries. On the other hand, by 1848, the United States was no longer a third world country. It had become a major transcontinental power. The revolution in communications facilitated this transformation. And improvements in transportation, such as the Erie Canal, the steamboat, and the railroad, had also wrought enormous changes by 1848. Americans were more and more integrated into a global economy. The improvements in transportation and communication liberated people from the tyranny of distance. And by that I mean that they liberated people from isolation, economic, intellectual, political isolation. Meanwhile, America was extending its territory westward until it stretched from sea to sea, creating a transcontinental empire that these improvements in transportation and communications could integrate. So, the America of 1848 was significantly more like the America of today than it had been in 1815. It's useful to compare the impact of the telegraph with that of the Internet in our own time. The telegraph probably lowered the cost of business transactions even more than did the Internet, and it certainly seemed to contemporaries an even more dramatic innovation. Commercial applications of Morse's invention followed quickly. Most Americans then earned their living through agriculture. American farmers and planters increasingly produced their food and fiber for far-off markets. Their merchants and bankers welcomed the chance to get news of distant prices and credit. The newly invented railroads used the telegraph to schedule trains so they wouldn't collide on the single tracks of that period. The electric telegraph solved commercial problems and at the same time had huge political implications. Along with improvements in printing, it facilitated an enormous growth of newspapers, which in turn facilitated the development of mass political parties. To sum up then, the telegraph had much the same effects in the 19th century that the Internet is having today. To speed up and enable commerce, to decouple communication from travel, to foster globalization, and to encourage democratic participation. The Tsar of Russia worried about the democratic implications of the telegraph, just as the rulers of China today worry about the democratic implications of the Internet. Well, let's see how this works. Samuel F.B. Morse, Finley Morse, as his family called him. He had a good head for business and for publicizing his invention. He always insisted upon being addressed as professor, even though his professorship had nothing to do with his inventing the telegraph. Morse was not a professor of engineering or applied science or anything like that. He was a professor of art. He taught painting at New York University. And he was, in fact, a very talented painter of portraits and historical panoramas. That is a portrait of President James Monroe, painted while he was in the White House by Samuel F.B. Morse, showing, you see, that he was a talented portraitist. It also reminds us that Morse was a highly regarded artist in his time, since, after all, the president wouldn't sit for just anybody. And this is the telegraph receiver, the one that was in Baltimore and received the message that Morse transmitted. As far as I know, the device that Morse used in Washington no longer exists, but this one is in the Museum of the College of Engineering of Cornell University. When Morse failed to get a government commission to paint the giant historical murals on the inside of the dome of the White House, the Capitol building in Washington, he was bitterly disappointed, and he turned away in anger from painting, and he took up instead what had until that time only been a hobby of his, that is, exploring the possibility of electric telegraphy. Morse started out by assuming that his invention would be a government-owned monopoly. The post office, after all, was a government monopoly, and that was the model that he had in mind. The money to stretch the wires from Washington to Baltimore came from a congressional appropriation. But it turned out that party politics got in the way of government ownership of the telegraph. The party that endorsed active government encouragement of business, industry, and transportation was called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. The party in power, however, was the Jacksonian Democratic Party, which favored strict laissez-faire. Morse himself was a Democrat, but even he couldn't interest the Democratic administration of President James Knox Polk in owning and operating the telegraph. Well, the telegraph did turn out eventually to be a monopoly, but a privately owned one. The Western Union Company, in which Morse owned a large share, dominated the American telegraph network from 1866 on. Even long after the invention of the telephone, Western Union telegrams remained a prominent feature of American life. I'm old enough, I may be the only person here who's that old, but I'm old enough to remember when you announced the birth of a child or a wedding or some other major event in your family to your friends and relatives by sending them telegrams, okay? Well, Western Union transmitted its last telegram on January 27th, 2006. Hand in hand with the improvements in communications were improvements in transportation. This picture here shows the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1836. I love this picture. This is one of my favorites. And the thing that I most like about it, of course, is that the early railroad cars, passenger cars, look like stagecoaches. And they look like stagecoaches for exactly the same reason that the first automobiles looked like horseless carriages, right? Now, the early locomotives and the early steamboats both had horrific safety records because their boilers would often explode. And here you see the steamer, the Ben Sherrod, is exploding with considerable loss of life on the Mississippi River in 1837. Instant long-range communications, coupled with the improvements in transportation represented by railroads, steamboats, and canals, revolutionized American life between 1815 and 1848. The inventions in printing and the improvements in transportation facilitated the production and distribution of books. This is what enabled the rise of the novel as a literary genre. The newly efficient post office carried the cheap newspapers and political tracts that made mass politics possible. Mass literacy and the institutions that fostered literacy acquired increased civic importance. And, of course, now we're getting to one of those issues that so concerned Professor Driggs, the spread of literacy and of reading materials. Only a literate public would be able to make use of the new media and realize their potential. So both post offices and public schools became central to the political controversies of the 19th century. The multiplication of local post offices expanded the federal bureaucracy and became a great source of political patronage. In every little community, there was somebody who wanted to either become or remain the local postmaster, and who would get his friends and neighbors out to vote the right way so that he could get or keep that job. Also, during these years of the early to mid-19th century, a new rationale appeared for public schools. In early America, the reason for fostering mass literacy was so that people could read the Bible. That was what schools were for. But now, a secular justification for public schools appears alongside the religious one. The new reason why public schools were so important was to nurture a well-informed citizenry. In the earlier times, only New England had really comprehensive public schools because it was the most religious part of the country. Now, gradually, other parts of the country began to provide better public education. And as the schools multiplied, the politicians argued over who should control them and whether the teachers' jobs should be part of the political patronage. With the expansion of the printed media, battles over public opinion became more fervent. The new media of communication brought rival party programs to the attention of a wider public than had ever before been politically engaged. In fact, a higher percentage of the electorate, the legally qualified electorate, voted in the 19th century than goes to the polls today. Yeah. This shows a polling place in pre-Civil War America. You can see a great many people in this picture. Every person you can see is male, reminding us that politics then was a male activity, a male monopoly, if you like. Notice that the voting is not secret. The voter first takes an oath that he is who he says he is and that he's legally entitled to vote. And then he tells the clerks who are recording the votes how he votes. He just tells them. There's no secrecy about it. The artist has tried very hard to show both the strengths and the weaknesses of this kind of frontier democracy. Here are some men who are earnestly discussing politics, but there are others who are just getting drunk. This guy is so drunk he can't walk, but he's going to be carried up to vote. And he was probably given liquor to reward him for voting a certain way. But the major political parties were not the only beneficiaries of improved communications and the spread of the printed media. Religious movements benefited as well, and in some ways even faster and quicker. Here's a familiar kind of 19th century American religious event, a revival meeting. If you look in the background, whoops, if you look, oh dear. Okay, here we are. If you look in the background there, you'll see all these tents. And those tents are pitched because people would come for quite a ways to attend this event. And once they were there, they didn't want to turn around and go home immediately, so they would camp out. And that's why events like this were often called camp meetings. Now, you see, everybody in the previous picture was male. Lots of the people here are female. And you also notice that some people are reacting very strongly to what the preacher is saying. This man is deeply repentant. But other people are taking it all very casually, and they're just chatting, or maybe seem merely curious. And all of that is authentic. Now, this is a wonderful, wonderful picture. It was a poster created by a nationwide Christian society, the American Tract Society. It published religious tracts. And the angel is hovering over the printing press, symbolizing that the printing press is a providential instrument for the dissemination of Christianity. Here you see this girl who is reading a religious tract. She illustrates, of course, what Howard Driggs was very interested in, the promotion of literacy, and the promotion of literacy for moral and religious purposes. Okay? Over here you can see the overseas missions carrying Christian tracts overseas. This is probably Constantinople, to judge from the architecture. And here's a Christian missionary passing out tracts to a woman and her child. Well, now we can see why, when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, he was able to reach a large audience. The Book of Mormon could be distributed not only around the United States, but all over the Atlantic world. Converts could be made in Western Europe and so on. Well, let's go back to Morse's demonstration message, "What hath God wrought?" It came, of course, from the Bible, the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 23. "It shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought?" Professor Morse's girlfriend, Annie Ellsworth, had suggested the verse to him as appropriate for the occasion. And the quotation proved the perfect choice, capturing the inventor's own passionate Christian faith and his conception of himself as an instrument of providence. As Morse later commented, the message, "What hath God wrought," quote, "baptized the American telegraph with the name of its author, God." The American public appreciated the significance of the message because biblical religion permeated the culture in ways both conventional and sincerely felt. Morse's demonstration exemplified a synthesis of science with religion. and it represented the predominant American attitude of his time. Only a few eccentrics worried about any conflict between scientific and religious truth. Revelation and reason alike, Americans were confident, led to knowledge of God and His creation. Today, the hypothesis that the universe reflects intelligent design has provoked a bitter debate in the United States. How very different was the intellectual world of the early 19th century. Then virtually everyone believed in intelligent design. Even the outspoken critics of Christianity at that time embraced not atheism, but deism. That is, belief in an impersonal remote deity who had created the universe and designed it so perfectly that it ran along of its own accord, following natural laws. And so essentially everybody believed in intelligent design. Awakenings of religion, expansion of education, interest in science, technological progress, all these went hand in hand. Evangelists welcomed technological advances along with mass education as helping them spread the good news of Christ, just as we saw in that poster. Like education and science, literature was saturated with moral meanings and motivations. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, spread her moral views to an amazing audience, unprecedented on both sides of the Atlantic. And in later years, of course, Professor Driggs wrote his didactic novels for young people that clearly reinforce the moral messages that he wants to present, like understanding between the Indians and white people and messages like that. Okay? So the writers of the American literary Renaissance took advantage of the improvements in communications technology to market their art and their moral values to more widespread audiences than any writers before had ever enjoyed. But now it's time to turn to the other great concern of Howard Driggs, that is the westward movement, which was also affected by improved transportation and communications. Now, significantly, the Mormons had moved to Utah before the great improvements occurred. The telegraph had only just barely been invented when they moved, but it certainly had not reached to Utah. The Transcontinental Railroad lay in the future. And the Mormons, in first coming to Utah, expected and hoped that they would be relatively isolated, that they could be self-sufficient and not be bothered by their former persecutors. But as we know, things didn't work out quite in accordance with those expectations. Gold was discovered in California in 1848. That's only a couple of years after the Mormons first come to Utah. And when gold is discovered in California, it reveals the pivotal stage of communications at that moment. In some ways, the discovery of gold in California illustrates the immemorial limitations on communications because, of course, there was no telegraph, not yet a Pony Express or a railroad reaching to California. So, news of the discovery of gold traveled fastest around the Pacific Rim because water transportation and communication were so much faster than over land. It took months for the news of the gold to cross the continent of North America and then get across the Atlantic to Europe. But even so, the response to the discovery of gold in California illustrated some of the tremendous strides that transportation and communication had made in just a few decades. Now we'll go on. Okay, here's California. This was drawn from life in 1848. The 49ers haven't even left home yet. These are the very first people. They're all scrambling around individually, trying to find gold. Very few of them have actually pitched any kind of tent or teepee, which is true. The first people to seek gold did so with such single-mindedness that they devoted no attention to amenities. Some people are already fighting among themselves. In general, it's a very anarchic society and completely different from early Utah, which is a well-organized society even in the beginning. But news of the discovery of gold begins to spread around the country. And this wonderful picture shows how the news is spreading. The painting is called California News by an artist called William Sidney Mount. There are so many things to point out to you about it. For one thing, we were in a post office. The post office is where you went to get your mail. It wasn't delivered to your house. Okay? And with your mail came all the newspapers or magazines that you subscribed to. So here's a man who's reading about California in the newspaper. Wow, look how interested she is. Everybody around is crowding around to hear what he's reading out loud. And by the way, this reminds us that in earlier centuries, reading out loud was much, much more common than it is today. People would often read to each other. Here's an interesting touch. Notice the black man who is interested too, but he has to stand in back of the crowd. And sometimes historians talk about certain kinds of social groups being marginalized. We see that literally in this picture. He is on the margin of the picture. Now this man is selling tickets. He's selling tickets on a ship to go to California. And that's the ship. It's got a Chinese name telling us that the ship used to be engaged in the China trade. But now, since the discovery of gold in California, everybody wants to embark on a ship to California. So the ships that were previously engaged in commerce are now loading passengers and taking them to California. And do you know that the people wanted to go to the gold fields so much that when the ships would arrive in San Francisco Bay, not only did all the passengers get off and head for the gold fields, all the crew got off and headed for the gold fields too, leaving abandoned ships floating in San Francisco Bay. Okay, so this then is telling us about how the news of California finally spread. But both California and Utah were initially part of Mexico, and they only become part of the United States as a result of a war. The war between the United States and Mexico. And this is a drawing that appeared in a newspaper of the time. It shows the Battle of Monterrey. That's Monterrey, Mexico, not Monterey, California. And this is the climactic moment of that war, the occupation of Mexico City by the United States Army. How many people have been to Mexico City, right? Okay, quite a number. Well, those of you who have been to Mexico City will, of course, recognize where we are, because this is the central plaza of Mexico City, which looks much the same today that it did then. That's the 16th century Spanish cathedral. That's the Palacio Nacional, where the presidents of Mexico live and where the Aztec emperors lived earlier. The Americans referred to it as the halls of the Montezumas. And when General Scott, who is right here, when General Scott entered the city, he ordered a detachment of Marines to occupy the Hall of the Montezumas, and that's where we get the Marines hymn, you know, from the Halls of Montezuma. Okay, so the municipal authorities have surrendered the city to the invading army, but the populace continued to resist by whatever means were at their disposal. And so we see this man here who has picked up a rock intending to throw it at the invaders. But this American here on the white horse, looking over his shoulder, sees him and will probably prevent it. Now, the war against Mexico was highly controversial in the United States. Many Americans disapproved of waging the war. They said, this is a war of conquest, but others welcomed the war. And here you see how the news media are playing up the war. Once again, it's a post office. Notice the post office sign. Once again, a man is reading aloud from the newspaper. Once again, all these people are crowding around to hear him. Once again, the African Americans want to hear too, but they're marginalized, right? And then the most perhaps remarkable marginalized person in the whole picture is the only woman in the picture. And I'm afraid you can't see her very well, but there she is, and she is sticking her head out the window of the post office to try to listen to what's going on. But again, she's marginalized. Among the Americans who were bitterly critical of the war against Mexico was a young member of the House of Representatives from Illinois, Congressman Abraham Lincoln. And there he is in 1846. And, of course, long before he grew his famous beard, and he made fiery speeches in the House of Representatives denouncing President Polk for waging a war of aggression. And now we come to another event of 1848, and that is the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention in world history. And this is Lucretia Coffin Mott, who is one of the leaders of that convention. And I call to your attention the fact that the telegraph enabled news of that convention to be spread all over the country. The newspapers covered it all over the country. Of course, they didn't necessarily approve of the convention and what the women were doing. They often ridiculed and mocked it. But the most important feature was that they reported it so that people learned about it and could make up their own minds whether they approved or not. And prominent among the demands made at that convention in 1848 was not only the right to vote, which is what we often think of, but the right to an equal education. In other words, the right of women to go to college, for example. And it is indeed quite amazing that the United States became the world pioneer in higher education for women. By the 1880s, already a third of all the college students in the United States were women. No other country in the world had anything like that. So, we can see here the effects of the communications revolution on two of the major concerns of the great Professor Howard Driggs, the westward movement and the spread of literacy for moral purposes. Thank you very much. I can't resist showing you this picture because it tells so much about the history and development of the West. Here's the railroad going west. Here are the telegraph lines built right alongside the railway, as they typically were. Here are the children going to school. Here are the families going west in their covered wagons. Here are the Indians watching it all, no doubt with considerable misgivings. One time, I intended to use this picture for the dust jacket of my book, but my editor discovered that this picture had been painted in 1866 and my book was supposed to end in 1848, so painting was no longer appropriate for my book, and I used a different one, but one which still celebrates American economic development, as you will see when you look at the actual dust jacket. Now, I don't know what your custom is, but my custom is to take questions and comments at this point. So if anybody has anything they would like to ask or say or protest about or complain about, then fine, now is a good time.